Part 1. Sowing the Wind. O masters, lords, and rulers in all lands, how will the future reckon with this man? How answer his brute question in that hour, when whirlwinds of rebellion shake all shores? How will it be with kingdoms and with kings, with those who shaped him to the thing he is, when this dumb terror shall rise to judge the world after the silence of the centuries? From Edwin Markham's The Man with the Hoe. Chapter 1. Longbow Village. Times and seasons, what things are you, bringing to my life ceaseless change? I will lodge forever in this hollow, where springs and autumns unheeded pass. Dao Yun. Longbow Village lies in the southeast quarter of Shanxi Province, on the high plateau country that butts against the back of the Daihang Mountains. It is 400 miles southwest of Beijing, and 100 miles from the gap in the mountains directly to the south, through which the Yellow River flows out onto the North China Plain. The South Shanxi Plateau, known as the Shangtang, associated with heaven, because of its elevation, is itself creased with barren mountains, but between the ranges are wide valleys containing considerable areas of fertile soil. In the heart of one of these valleys lies the old country town of Changchi. The road running north from Changchi proceeds on the level for 7 miles, through and past numerous mud villages, and then climbs gently over a long hill. Just beyond the hill, where the land levels out again, is the village of Longbow. Footnote: since the county line runs along the southern edge of the hill, Longbow is not in Changchi County, but in the county of Lucheng, the next walled town to the north. The counties of China have traditionally been divided into several districts, or chu, for administrative purposes. The southwestern district of Lucheng County was called the 5th District. If Longbow had any distinction at all, it was as the seat of the 5th District administration. The land revolution in Longbow began with the retreat and surrender of the Japanese army and its Chinese puppet forces in 1945. For how many centuries prior to that year this village had endured in this place almost without change, I do not know. Certainly for hundreds of years, any tired traveler who paused to rest at the crest of the hill and looked out over the flat to the north saw substantially the same sight: a complex of adobe walls under a canopy of trees set in the middle of a large expanse of fields. These fields were barren, brown, and desolate in winter, while in summer they were green, yellow, and clothed with diverse crops. To look down on this valley in January was to look upon a world of frozen immobility. Through most of each day, not even a wisp of smoke could be seen curling up from the squat mud chimneys that poked above the gently sloping roofs marking the settlement. The rich, who kept their fires burning day and night, burned a coal and earth mixture that gave off no smoke, and the poor, who burned roots, straw, and wild dry grasses, lit their fires only at mealtime, and then only long enough to boil a few handfuls of millet. In the depths of winter, the temperature often went below 0. Rich and poor alike stayed indoors. Only on the main north-south road could any sign of human activity be seen. This was the route taken by the carters who hauled freight out of the mountains, regardless of weather. In the stillness of the cold mountain air, the crashing of their iron-shod wheels against the frozen ruts could be heard at a great distance. From the top of the hill, it sounded like the rumbling of distant drums or the busy pounding of some tireless carpenter knocking together a hollow barrel. With the coming of warm weather, this all but lifeless scene was transformed. From the first cock crow in the semi-darkness before dawn until the red sun went down behind the western mountains at night, peasants by the hundreds came and went on the land, plowing, hauling manure, planting, harvesting. There were always so many people in the fields that they could talk to one another as they worked without leaving their own plots. From the hill, this scene took on the likeness of some slow-motion ritual dance of man and nature that completely obscured the painful, back-breaking labor that was in progress. The stage never seemed to be crowded. Yet everywhere the eye rested, something was sure to move. Here a donkey strained at the plow. There a man, stripped to the waist, raked together corn stubble. Nearby a barefoot boy spread night soil. 3 women on their knees thinned millet. A child, naked as the day he entered this world, played with some sticks in a ditch. Over the traveler's head, the warm, motionless air hummed and whistled as a flight of swallows swooped low. Birds, people, oxen, sheep, children, dogs. It was like one of Bruegel's marvelously crowded paintings. And always in the background, the heavily laden carts moved in both directions, their iron thunder muffled now by the long-thawed resilience of the loess-like soil. If the traveler, rested at last, walked on down the hill, he found that the village street was but the continuation of the long gully that had brought him from the heights. During the heavy July rains, the runoff from all the higher ground to the south rushed down the gully, poured along the village street, and emptied into the village pond, a large natural basin conveniently located at the center of the community. In this way, the supply of soft water for washing clothes was periodically replenished, and in the shade of the willows by the water's edge, a few women and girls could always be found scrubbing away on the flat rocks that served as washboards. Both sides of this gully-like main street were lined with mud walls 6 to 8 feet high, broken here and there by covered gateways that led into the courtyards of the people. Beside each gate was the family privy, hopefully placed at the edge of the public road in anticipation of a contribution to the domestic store of fertilizer from any traveler who might be in need of relief. Running off at right angles from the main road were several smaller lanes, also lined with walls set at intervals with courtyard gates. From these lanes, still smaller alleys ran off in turn to other entrances, so that the whole village was rather like a maze, regular in outline, yet haphazardly filled in with lanes, alleys, walls enclosing courtyards, and low mud houses built against these walls. Over the centuries, in spite of much new construction, the village persisted in presenting a crumbled look. Built of adobe from the earth underfoot, any neglected wall, any unattended roof soon returned, under the hammering of summer rains, to the soil from whence it came. Always there were walls that had collapsed, gates that had fallen down, roofs that had buckled. In places one could wander into courtyards directly from the street through great gaps in the adobe, and people continually found new shortcuts and created new paths along which to move from house to house. Only the rich could afford to keep their walls standing sharp and clean, capped with the lime and straw mixture that alone could withstand a few seasons of weather. Some of the gentry even built with fired brick. Such houses stood through many generations, while the peasants' huts washed out, were rebuilt, and washed out again and again. Beside the village pond, whose banks served as a social center as well as a laundry for the women, was an open space large enough to park many carts and still leave the main road free. Day and night there were always carts in this square, for while the most heavily traveled route skirted the village to the east, many a driver, on reaching Longbow, was hungry enough, tired enough, or lonely enough to direct his animals into the village street and pull up in the square in search of refreshment, rest, and companionship. All 3 were offered by the village inn, which served hot water to all comers, and to the hungry, steamed bread, noodles, or unleavened pancakes, chopped up in order to be fried or boiled together with whatever vegetables were in season. Owned at different times by various prosperous gentry and run by one or another of their agents or dependents, this inn was nothing more than an adobe hut with a canopy of reed matting built out over the street in front to shelter a table or 2. Behind the hut, a long shed contained a platform for the carters to sleep on, and, at the far end, a set of feed troughs from which their animals could dine on chopped straw and kaoliang stalks. Beside the inn was a little store that had also changed hands many times. It was a down-at-the-heels adobe structure, with a squeaking door and tattered paper on the windows. Out front, sheltered from the sun by a reed mat similar to that which adorned the inn, the storekeeper could usually be found sipping hot water from a cracked teapot as he concentrated on a game of Chinese chess. Inside, he sold tobacco, soap, towels, needles, wine, bean oil, salt, sugar, biscuits, a little cloth, and other assorted articles necessary to daily life that could not be made at home. There was no hurry about such sales. Customers, as often as not, joined the storekeeper in a game of chess before going inside to make their purchases. Soldiers could usually be seen loitering about the store and inn. In earlier times, they were the troops of the imperial garrison, commanded by Manchu officers. In 1911, these were replaced by the conscripts of Yan Xishan, warlord governor of Shanxi, who were ousted in turn by the Japanese in 1938. These soldiers, regardless of their allegiance, were quartered on the people, lived a dissolute and corrupt life, and took whatever they wanted for their pleasure, including the wives and daughters of the poor peasants. Their officers, wined and dined by the gentry, pursued the same pleasures in more genteel surroundings and by more subtle means. In this they had the tacit consent of their hosts, who found in the troops a guarantee of their personal safety and the continued smooth collection of land rents. Just to the north of the store, and also on the edge of the square, was a solid brick and timber Buddhist temple, whose upturned roof corners might well remind the traveler of the propped-up flap of a Mongolian tent. This temple was built by the Shen clan, and was managed through the years by leading gentry of that name. There the people came to burn incense and offer prayers for good fortune, abundant crops, and many children. At several other points in and around the village there were small mud temples or shrines adorned with the clay likenesses of various minor gods, the god of agriculture, the god of fertility, and the god of health. At these temples also the people burned incense, murmured prayers, and left the offerings of steamed bread and sweet cakes that enabled many a poor beggar to survive. In the southern part of the village, a second clan temple sat in the center of the large courtyard. It was surrounded by numerous outbuildings, all of which, along with the temple itself, had long been abandoned to rats, dogs, and mischievous children. The only other points of interest in Longbow outside the village homes themselves were the distilleries and hole-in-the-wall craft establishments manned by peasants skilled at different trades. The number of distilleries varied over the years, depending on the prosperity of the landlord families that owned and ran them, but all of them made the same thing, a hard white liquor called pikar that was distilled from fermented sorghum or corn. The craft shops included a blacksmith's forge, a drug dispensary that carried in stock a few hundred of the many thousand drugs and herbs sold by Chinese apothecaries, a number of carpentry shops that made everything from wooden shovels to cartwheels, and several weaving establishments with looms capable of turning out rough cloth about 2 feet in width. No matter what these craftsmen did, in the summer they also worked on the land. It took every able-bodied person in the village to plant, hoe, and harvest the crops. Every able-bodied person, that is, save the landlords, who, with their inch-long fingernails and ankle-length gowns, never dreamed of soiling their hands with labor of any sort. The population of the village varied drastically in size. A poor crop year could easily cut the number of residents in half, a part of the poor dying in the huts where they lived, and the rest fleeing to other regions in a desperate gamble for survival. By and large, however, the 1,000 acres of land that encircled the village could support between 200 and 300 families, and no sooner did famine on the Shantung Plateau cut down the number of Longbow people and drive them to other places, than famine in other parts of North China drove new people to the plateau to settle in their place. The erratic nature of the weather was thus responsible for a very heterogeneous population. There are many villages in China where the majority of the inhabitants have the same surname, consider themselves to be of one family, and are in fact related by common descent from the original settlers. Not so in Longbow. The various families living there often bore as many as 40 different surnames. Even though the village itself was called Changchuang, or Chong settlement, by its inhabitants, often only a small minority of families bore that name. They were at times outnumbered 2 to 1 by the Wangs, and even the Guos surpassed them in households more than once. Other names common in the village were Shen, Li, and Shi, to mention but a few. Counting noses among the 200-odd families, one could ordinarily tally up about 1,000 persons altogether. This meant that on the average, there was 1 acre of land for every man, woman, and child. Footnote: the acres mentioned here and throughout the text of the book are English acres, each being equivalent to 6 Chinese mu. The crops from this 1 acre, in a good year, were ample for the support of a single person, considering the very low standard of living that prevailed. But the poor who rented land or worked out as hired laborers got less than half the crops they tilled, while the rich got the surplus from many acres. That is why some were able to build enormous underground tombs marked for eternity, or so they thought, with stone tortoises bearing obelisks inscribed with the family name, while others, when they died, were thrown into a hole in the ground with only a reed mat wrapped around them and a few shovelfuls of earth to mark the place. Graves large and small dotted the land around Longbow. As if this were not enough obstruction to tillage, the fields were divided into countless narrow strips and plots, each one owned by a different family. Even on the level, there were few fields larger than half an acre, while on the hill, where the land was terraced, there were strips only a few yards wide that ran in great S-curves around the slopes, and small triangles at the top end of gullies that contained but a few square yards of ground. Land was so valuable in the Shantung that the peasants found it necessary to build stone walls as high as 15 feet to hold back a few feet of earth and make it level. Where the hills were too steep to terrace, they plowed anyway and cropped the ground for a year or two until the soil washed away completely. In the mountains to the east of Longbow village, men plowed hills so steep that an extra person was needed to stand on the slope above and keep tension on a rope tied around the ox, lest he slip and roll away. Although on level ground roads and paths led out through the fields, no hill fields could be reached with a cart, and farm implements had to be light enough for one man to carry. The plows, harrows, seeders, and other equipment used were all light enough to be picked up with one hand, and were made entirely of wood, except for the point of the plow itself. All of these implements, although in use for centuries, were still only supplementary to the main tool, the hoe, handed down almost unchanged since prehistoric times. The hoe used in Longbow was a great iron blade weighing several pounds, and fastened to the end of a stick as large as a man's wrist. This tool, which was designed to turn soil and sod, was also used for the delicate work of thinning millet and weeding corn. By hard work, a man could hoe 1/6 of an acre a day. Since all the peasants aspired to hoe their crops at least 3 times, a great part of every growing season was spent in hoeing. The crops grew only on what was put into the soil each year, hence manure was the foundation of the whole economy. The chief source of supply was the family privy, and this became, in a sense, the center of the household. Longbow privies were built in the form of a deep cistern, topped with timber or stone, and provided with a single narrow slot at ground level for both deposition and extraction. Here night soil in liquid form accumulated all winter. Legendary in the region were the landlords so stingy that they would not allow their hired men to defecate in the fields, but made them walk all the way back to the ancestral home to deposit their precious burden. Other landlords would not hire local people on a long-term basis, because local people were wont to use their own privies, while a man from outside used that of his employer. Animal manure, together with any straw, stalks, or other waste matter, was composted in the yard. So highly was it valued that old people and children constantly combed the roads and cart tracks for droppings, which they scooped up and carried home in baskets. This need to conserve every kind of waste and return it to the land was responsible for the tidy appearance of the streets and courtyards, even though the walls were crumbling and the roofs falling in. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was left lying around. Even the dust of the street was swept up and thrown onto the compost heap or into the privy, for village dust was more fertile by far than the soil in the fields. The clothes that people wore and the food that they ate were all products of the village land. Even the gentry, who possessed for festive occasions silks and satins imported from the south, donned for everyday wear the same homespun cottons that served to clothe their servants and their tenants. Though styles did evolve over the centuries, the basic workday clothing changed little. In summer, everyone wore thin jackets and pants of natural cotton, bleached white, or dyed blue or black with indigo. Longbow women liked to wear white jackets and black pants, but this was by no means universal. In cold weather, everyone wore clothes padded with cotton. These made people look twice as big as they really were, and provided warmth in 2 ways. First, by the insulation of the thick layer of cotton, and second by the lice which made themselves at home in the seams. Since the padded clothes could not be washed without taking the lining out, a major operation, it was almost impossible to get rid of lice from day to day. Their constant biting and the interminable scratching that accompanied it generated a fair amount of heat. On any warm day in winter, a large number of people could always be found sitting in various sunlit corners with their padded jackets across their knees. There they hunted the lice, picked them out, and crushed them expertly between their thumbnails. Children under 5 were exposed from below in all weather because their padded clothes were not sewn together at the crotch. The slit, which ran upward from just above the knees to a point a little below the tip of the backbone, was very convenient when nature called, but was drafty in winter. It must be said, however, that the children didn't seem to mind at all, and ran about in the bitterest weather, just as if they were all sewn in like their elders. Shantung shoes were also made of cotton cloth, but because the soles consisted of many layers sewn through and through with hemp thread, they were as tough as any leather, and lasted from 4 to 6 months, even with hard wear on the mountain roads. Only the women had no need for such heavy shoes. Their feet were bound, the toes bent under, and the bones stunted so they formed a crushed stump, not more than 2 or 3 inches in length. Women walked as if on stilts. They could not run at all. Yet widowed women among the poor often had to work in the fields from dawn until dark. Foot binding came to an end almost everywhere in the period between the 2 world wars, but even in 1945, young girls with crippled feet could still be found in the mountain counties of Shanxi. The food eaten in Longbow was very simple. Since maize was a major crop, everyone ate corn dumplings, called keta, in the morning, and cornmeal mush, or noodles made of corn, at noon. At night, they ate millet porridge with a few noodles in it. After the wheat harvest in July, everyone ate noodles for several days, but this was considered quite a luxury, and only the most fortunate carried the custom on into August. These same families were the only ones who ate 3 meals a day throughout the year. Most people cut down to 2 meals, or even 1 when winter set in. Thus undernourished, they moved about as little as possible and tried to conserve their strength until spring. In addition to the cereal grains, people ate salt turnip all year round, cabbage when they had it, and other vegetables such as eggplant, scallions, chives, and wild herbs in season. But these were simply garnishment to the main dish, which was always corn, millet, or wheat. The big problem facing the peasants over the years was not to obtain some variety in their diet, but to find anything to eat at all. They often had to piece out their meager harvest of grain with bran, chaff, wild herbs from the hills, or even the leaves from the trees or tree bark as the chunhuang, spring hunger, set in. Each day that one survived was a day to be thankful for, and so, throughout the region, in fat years and in lean, the common greeting came to be not "hello" or "how are you," but a simple, heartfelt "have you eaten?"